One man built Africa's largest industrial empire. Another quietly built a rival strong enough to challenge it. And both are fighting for something every Nigerian uses every single day: fuel. In a country where oil flows from the ground, millions still line up, struggle, and pay heavily just to power their lives. That contradiction didn't happen by accident. It created an opportunity, and only a few men were powerful enough to seize it. At the center of it all is Aliko Dangote. From trading commodities in the 1970s, he built Dangote Group into a dominant for cement, sugar, salt, industries that literally built modern Nigeria. At one point, his cement company controlled the majority of the market. His name became synonymous with scale, dominance, and control. But dominance attracts something dangerous: competition. Enter Abdul Samad Rabiu. Less loud, less flashy, but just as strategic. Through BUA Group, he expanded aggressively: cement, sugar, infrastructure, stepping into industries where Dangote was already king. And unlike many before him, he didn't back down. This wasn't just business anymore. It became a rivalry Nigerians could feel in cement prices, in market shifts, in headlines. A quiet battle between two billionaires with billions on the line. But everything changed when the focus shifted to one sector: oil. Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer. Yet for decades, it depended on imported fuel, broken refineries, policy failures, a system that made no sense. Until you realize how profitable that dysfunction was. And then came the biggest industrial gamble in African history: the Dangote refinery. A single project designed to change everything: end fuel imports, control supply, and reshape the entire market. But here's the part no one expected: Dangote wouldn't be alone, because somewhere in the background, watching every move, was BUA. And what started as competition was about to evolve into something much bigger. Nigeria produces oil, billions of dollars worth, yet for decades, it couldn't refine enough fuel for itself. It sounds impossible until you see the system behind it. For years, Nigeria relied on state-owned refineries operated by the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. There were four major ones: Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna. On paper, they had the capacity to refine hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. In reality, they barely worked. Breakdowns became normal. Maintenance was delayed. Reports showed billions spent with little improvement. At times, these refineries operated at near zero capacity. So the country did something shocking. It started importing fuel. Despite being Africa's largest crude oil producer, Nigeria became dependent on foreign refineries shipping crude out and buying it back as petrol. More expensive, more complicated, and deeply inefficient. But here's where it gets even more serious. To keep fuel affordable, the government introduced subsidies. On the surface, it helped citizens. But underneath, it created one of the most controversial systems in Nigeria's history. Billions were spent annually. Investigations linked the system to fraud, inflated claims, and massive financial leakages. The fuel supply chain became amazing porters, middlemen, regulators, subsidies, a system so complex few truly understood it. This structure drained the country's finances, and it created the biggest opportunity in the energy sector. If someone could refine fuel locally at scale, they wouldn't just build a business. They would control a critical part of Nigeria's economy. And one man decided to do exactly that. While others saw risk, he saw control. While others hesitated, he went all in. The plan? Build a refinery so massive it could supply not just Nigeria but all of West Africa. When Aliko Dangote made the decision, he wasn't just entering the oil business, he was trying to solve a national problem. Announced in the 2010s, the project was designed with a refining capacity of about 650,000 barrels per day. The cost? Over $19 billion, one of the most expensive industrial projects on the continent. The location? Lekki Free Zone in Lagos, strategically placed near the coast for crude supply and export logistics. But building it was another story. Years passed, deadlines shifted, costs increased, global crashes and the pandemic slowed construction. Critics called it too ambitious. Others called it unrealistic. But Dangote kept going. In 2023, the refinery was officially commissioned, a moment that drew attention across Africa and beyond. But commissioning was just the beginning. Controlling the market, that was something else entirely. If one refinery supplies most of the fuel, who controls the price? Who controls the future? And while the spotlight stayed on Dangote, someone else was watching very closely. BUA was paying attention. Abdul Samad Rabiu had already built a reputation for entering sectors dominated by giants. Through BUA Group, he had challenged dominance before. In those markets, one pattern emerged. Where Dangote leads, BUA follows then competes. The stakes weren't cement or sugar supply. They were fuel prices. Everything depended on it. BUA was watching, calculating, positioning. In industries like this, the first move isn't always the loudest. And that quiet build-up leads to the next phase where competition stops being theoretical and starts becoming visible in the market. By now, the spotlight was fixed on one name, Dangote. The refinery was live, the scale was unmatched, and the narrative was already forming. One man could redefine Nigeria's fuel market, but in Nigeria's industrial history, no dominance goes unchallenged for long, because this wasn't the first time Aliko Dangote had reached the top of a sector. And it wasn't the first time someone tried to meet him there. That someone was Abdul Samad Rabiu. Through BUA Group, Rabiu had already built a reputation for entering high-barrier industries and staying in them. Cement, sugar, infrastructure. These weren't small markets, and in each one, Dangote was already deeply established. But BUA didn't avoid competition. It walked straight into it. In the cement sector, both companies expanded production capacity aggressively. Prices became a national conversation. Regulators were pulled into disputes, and suddenly, what looked like a one-player market had a serious challenger. That history mattered, because it showed something important. BUA doesn't just coexist, it competes. So when the fuel conversation started shifting toward local refining, people began asking a quiet question: would BUA respond? Not necessarily by copying the refinery model, but by positioning itself somewhere in the same value chain. Publicly, Abdul Samad Rabiu maintained a measured tone. In interviews and reports, he emphasized competition, efficiency, and market balance. No dramatic declarations, no direct confrontation, but in business, silence isn't always neutrality. Sometimes it's strategy. Because entering a sector like refining isn't just about building infrastructure. It's about timing, capital, policy, and knowing exactly where the pressure points are. And right now, all the pressure was building around one thing: who would influence the final price Nigerians pay for fuel? That's where competition becomes unavoidable. Because once pricing enters the conversation, it stops being about companies and starts affecting everyone. And the moment that happens, rivalry becomes visible. But to understand how intense this rivalry can get, you have to go back to where it truly escalated. Not oil, not fuel, cement, because that's where both giants tested each other and proved they were willing to fight for market control. At this point, it wasn't just business anymore. It was policy, power, and control over something every Nigerian depends on. Once subsidies were removed under Bola Tinubu, the government stepped back from directly fixing fuel prices. But stepping back didn't mean losing influence. Because in Nigeria's oil sector, the government still controls one critical piece: crude. Through the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, the state remains deeply involved in crude oil supply import arrangements, strategic partnerships, and that's where things get interesting. For a refinery like the Dangote refinery to operate at full capacity, it needs a steady, reliable flow of crude oil. But crude isn't just sitting there waiting. It's traded globally, priced in dollars, and influenced by international demand. So even within Nigeria, access to crude becomes a strategic issue. At different points, reports and public discussions highlighted negotiations around how much crude would be supplied locally, in what currency, naira versus dollars, under what pricing structure, because these decisions directly affect one thing: final fuel price. If crude is bought in dollars and the naira weakens, production costs rise, and those costs don't disappear. They move straight to the consumer. So now, the system looks like this. The government influences crude supply. The refinery controls large-scale processing. The market reacts to both. It's a triangle of power. And inside the triangle, every decision matters. This is why the conversation around fuel pricing became so intense. Not just among economists or policymakers, but across the country. Because people weren't just asking why prices were high. They were asking something deeper. Who is actually in charge? Is it the government that controls crude, the refinery that processes it, or the market that sets the final price? And right in the middle of that uncertainty, competition starts to look less like business and more like influence. Because if another major player enters strategically, it doesn't just add supply, it shifts power. And that's exactly why the narrative began to change. What started as a single massive refinery project was now being seen as part of a larger struggle: control versus competition. And once that idea takes hold in public perception, it spreads fast. Media picks it up, analysts debate it, social media amplifies it, and just like that, a business rivalry becomes a national storyline. The kind people give a name to, the kind that starts being called a war. It didn't begin in boardrooms. It began in conversations, at fuel stations, on radio shows, across social media. People were no longer just talking about fuel prices. They were talking about who controls them. And slowly, a phrase started to form. Not official, not declared, but powerful enough to spread. A refinery war. On one side, Aliko Dangote, with the massive Dangote refinery, a project capable of supplying a huge share of Nigeria's fuel demand. On the other, Abdul Samad Rabiu, leading BUA Group, a company already known for stepping into markets dominated by giants and changing the balance. No official fight, no public declaration, but the pattern was familiar. Nigerians had seen this before in cement. A dominant player rises, a challenger expands, prices become a national issue. Now, the same energy was being projected onto fuel. Media discussions started framing the situation carefully. Would one refinery dominate supply? Would competition emerge to balance pricing? Could Nigeria avoid creating a private sector monopoly? Economists weighed in. Some argued that large-scale local refining would eventually stabilize prices. Others warned that without enough competition, pricing power could concentrate. And then came the public reaction. For everyday Nigerians, the issue wasn't theory, it was survival. Transport fares were rising, food costs were climbing, small businesses were struggling with energy expenses. So when people heard that one refinery could influence supply, they didn't just see industry progress, they saw risk, and risk fuels narratives. Online, debates intensified. Is this a monopoly? Where is the competition? Will prices ever drop? Some saw Aliko Dangote as the solution, a man who finally built what the government couldn't. Others saw a different possibility: too much control in one place. And in the background, the idea of competition, real competition, started gaining support. Because in markets like fuel, competition isn't just economic, it's psychological. People want options. They want balance. They want to believe no single player holds all the power. And that belief is what gave the refinery war its momentum. Not because it was officially declared, but because it felt real. Two industrial giants, one critical sector, a country watching every move. And now, the final question remained. After all the tension, after all the narratives, what is actually happening today? Who is winning? Who is controlling what? And what does it mean for Nigeria's future? Because in the end, this isn't just a story about rivalry. It's about power. After all the headlines, all the tension, all the debate, what's actually happening right now? The truth is simpler than the narrative, and more complicated at the same time. The Dangote refinery is real, operational in phases, scaling gradually. Built by Aliko Dangote, it represents one of the biggest private industrial bets in African history. Its goal hasn't changed: reduce Nigeria's dependence on imported fuel, and eventually supply both local and regional markets. But even at that scale, it doesn't operate in isolation, because fuel pricing in Nigeria is no longer fixed. After subsidy removal under Bola Tinubu, prices are shaped by global crude oil markets, exchange rates, distribution costs, domestic supply, so no single entity, not even the largest refinery, can fully control the outcome. At the same time, BUA Group hasn't disappeared from the picture. Led by Abdul Samad Rabiu, it remains one of Nigeria's most aggressive industrial players. And history shows one thing clearly: where there is dominance, BUA looks for entry, not always by copying, but by positioning. So the real story isn't a declared war, it's something more subtle, a power balance in motion. On one side, a refinery large enough to shift national supply. On the other, a competitor with a track record of disrupting dominant markets. And above both, a government still controlling crude policy and economic direction through institutions like the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. So who wins? Not a single company, not immediately. The real outcome depends on three things: sustained local refining, true market competition, stable economic policy. If all three align, Nigeria could finally reduce its long-standing dependence on fuel imports. If they don't, then the same cycle continues, just with different players. And that's the reality behind the so-called refinery war. No official battle, no final victory, just a high-stakes struggle over something every Nigerian feels daily: the cost of energy. And the truth is, this story isn't over, because markets evolve, policies change, and competitors never stop watching. So the next move whoever makes it could redefine everything. Again, fuel built this story, but power is what keeps it going. Two giants, one market, no final winner yet. So here's the real question. If more competition enters, will prices actually drop? Or will control just change hands? Tell me what you think. Who should Nigerians trust with their fuel future?